Let me ask you a question. What do this guy, and this guy all share in common? Barring the superficial connections like being a big dinosaur with fire breath, there isn't much for the average viewer to identify beyond them sharing the same name. But if it was that simple, then why are all these guys considered Godzilla, but this guy not so much? Even beyond the canon of his iteration being redefined in the Millennium era of films, he was hardly ever really considered worthy of the Godzilla name even upon his release from diehard fans. It could be a little difficult then to properly define this connective tissue between nearly 80 years worth of well over 30 films. Because despite the radical character overhauls and wild shifts in tone, all of these are still considered true to the character of Godzilla. But why exactly is that? Well, in order to find this connection, there'd be no better place to start than the 1954 original. The biggest appeal of going back to the original comes in how different it is to all of its successors. Despite having the most clearly undeniable influence, none of the following films really try to even touch on what this film tackles to nearly the same degree. At this point, the notion that the original film was actually dark and serious and political, as opposed to all of its bastardized sequels that made the characters silly, has become the kind of fun fact that everybody already knows about yet still gets brought up over and over and over again. There's at least a bit of truth to this statement, but again, we're focused on what all of these films have in common, not why one is necessarily more valid than the others. One attribute to the original that feels massively overlooked by pop culture is the fact that Godzilla isn't really the villain at all. Now, I don't mean to sound trite when saying we were the true villains all along or something, but it's still a message that remains incredibly potent, at least in the context of the original. Early in the film, we see a village describe the practices of ancient cultures and how ritualistic sacrifices is what they use to keep the creature satiated. It's undeniably a bit inhumane, sure, but it was at least something to deal with Godzilla, and it leaves you to question if these ancient cultures were able to tackle certain issues more effectively than we do today. After all, Godzilla isn't a monster in the original, he's just an animal. A really old animal whose way of life was destroyed by modern humans, which resulted in him having no choice but to resurface and cause the rampant destruction the film is most known for. Godzilla is widely known for being a metaphor for the nuclear bomb in the original, but he also represents something greater. At the end of the film, Dr. Serizawa is forced to unleash a weapon far more dangerous than the bomb that created these issues in the first place. And it's here that we most clearly see what it is that defines Godzilla the most. In this case, Godzilla is a victim, a creature operating in the only way it knows how to, with its life cycle being disrupted and ultimately ended by humanity's obsession with power. Godzilla in this film showcases a side of humanity obsessed with power over the forces that we cannot control, and our desire to destroy it. Godzilla at his purest is a byproduct and representation of humanity itself. To illustrate this point further, let's take a more modern example to see if this idea remains any less true. Shin Godzilla is often lauded as the grand return to form for the legendary character, not only because of his preceding 12-year hiatus, but also because Godzilla hasn't been this in touch with his roots since the original. But what people don't bring up as often is the many fundamental differences between the two. For starters, Shin Godzilla does not examine humanity through the same lens as the original. The surface level conflicts are similar, with the giant monster surfacing and causing havoc to the humans desperately trying to find a solution to the issue. But the approach differs in some pretty important ways. In a similar vein to the original's nuclear inspirations, the film was made particularly as a response to the 2011 Tohoku earthquakes in Japan, which caused devastating tsunamis and resulted in the meltdown of 3 nuclear reactors in the Fukushima power plants, the worst recorded nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. The inability to take precautions towards these somewhat preventable damages from the Japanese government, as well as the following inability to adapt to sudden threats, revealed a certain level of incompetence that created a distrust among the general public. This is the perspective that Shin Godzilla explores. Whereas the original focuses on our obsession with controlling and destroying nature, Shin puts more emphasis on the government scrambling to figure out and consistently falling short of what's needed to deal with the threats at hand. Shin satirizes bureaucracy, but not quite through a pessimistic lens. It focuses on the government's incompetence, but presents them as more rationally flawed than malicious. We're all prone to making mistakes, which Shin Godzilla acknowledges at the largest scale, but it also showcases our ability to overcome our shortcomings. It isn't the overly bureaucratic decision-making that saves the day, but rather the outcasts and the misfits that band together, showing humanity at its best by celebrating unity as the means of overcoming disaster. It's a refreshingly optimistic breakdown of bureaucracy, and can easily serve as the inverse of the original Gojira. Despite this, they technically operate under the same general philosophy when pertaining to Godzilla himself. Godzilla is a reflection of the state of humanity and the environment around him. In the original, this represented our destructive obsession with being at the top of the food chain, causing an endless cycle of suffering whether by natural or man-made means. Shin Godzilla is just as much a reflection of humanity, criticizing the government's ability to properly react to sudden information that takes them out of their comfort zone. But the conclusion it comes to is that humanity can prove to be just as resilient as the titular character, showing an incredible ability to adapt to just about anything once we unite our efforts. By looking at Godzilla as a reflection of ourselves, it's easy to see the connective tissue between these two incredibly different interpretations of the character. But there's still a pretty big aspect of the character that's been missing from this video, and it might just be the purest example of the point I'm trying to make. When people talk about Godzilla in a somewhat serious format, they tend to leave out the sillier kaiju films that make up the bulk of his career and notoriety. Which is understandable. I mean, once you see what the character is capable of when taken more seriously, the other sillier films can seem like bastardized versions of what the character originally stood for. But, like I said earlier, Godzilla's connective tissue is that he represents us. And in that sense, these films are no exception. While the original and Shin explore humanity with a biting satirical edge, these films instead tend to focus on us at our best. There are clear bad guys motivated by greed or aliens hell-bent on world domination, and clear good guys that band together to use the power of hope and friendship, and Godzilla, to save the day and teach us a lesson on how we should be the best versions of ourselves we can be, usually with Godzilla walking off into the sunset. Admittedly, it explores us and our conflicts at probably our most simple, but it's undeniably entertaining nonetheless. I mean, what is there really to hate about good guys stopping bad guys from ruining the environment or something, while giant kaiju punch the shit out of each other in order to determine the fate of the world? These explorations of humanity aren't as nuanced as the more acclaimed film in the series, but the themes and conflicts that motivate every awesome, silly kaiju fight are just as pure as the original. The enemies in these movies tend to represent some sort of greater failing from humanity, whether it be pollution or corporate greed. And as Godzilla's role begins to shift more towards the heroic defender of humanity, he starts to represent something entirely different about us. The side of us that can rise from our own failings. Yes, the world is corrupt, oftentimes because of our own failures, but these versions of Godzilla show that we're always capable of changing the world for the better. It may not be easy, but it's always possible. It retains the pure themes that made the original so powerful in the first place, all the while never sacrificing being fun as hell. Through exploring all of these different versions of Godzilla, we can see the connective tissue that binds every iteration of the character together. Godzilla is ingrained in humanity itself, and this is the reason he's remained as relevant as he has throughout his nearly 70 years worth of films. In this way, he has a strangely symbiotic relationship with us. As whether showcasing our greatest triumphs or biggest failures, Godzilla will always remain a reflection of ourselves that we can learn from. And most importantly, the King of the Monsters never has to sacrifice the entertainment of it all to do so.